Black Maid noticed Monarch. Everyone ignored. She ended up saving Billionaire's life. The Langford estate was a palace disguised as a home. High ceilings, gold-framed paintings, expensive carpets so soft they muffled every step. But in its quietest room, behind heavy double doors, sat a man who once commanded entire boardrooms. Now reduced to a frail figure in a wheelchair, Edward Langford had built an empire with his mind and iron will, billionaire, philanthropist, dealmaker. But none of that mattered now. At 74, his world had shrunk to this suite, a fireplace he rarely felt warm enough to enjoy, and a view of gardens he no longer walked through. His recent heart surgery had been successful. At least that's what the doctors kept saying. But recovery had left him pale, thin, and easily tired. Everyone treated him like a fragile heirloom. Everyone except her. Grace Williams moved quietly, almost invisibly, through the Langford estate. She was a maid hired only months before the surgery. A black woman in her late 20s with calm eyes and a measured step. She seemed to glide rather than walk. Her crisp black and white uniform was always spotless. Her hair neatly pulled back. She spoke only when needed. But when she did, people noticed. Grace noticed things others didn't. While the on-call doctors discussed Edward's chart in clipped voices, she noticed the slight tremor in his left hand when he reached for his tea. While the butler assured guests that Mr. Langford is recovering wonderfully, she caught the way his breath hitched after climbing the slightest incline in his wheelchair. No one asked for her opinion, so she kept her thoughts to herself until the morning she saw it. She had just finished polishing the brass lamp by his bedside when Edward shifted in his chair. The collar of his thick brown robe fell open, revealing a faint patch of red just above his heart. At first she thought it was a drop of tea, but when she stepped closer, her stomach tightened. It was blood, not bright, fresh blood, but dark, seeping through in a slow, steady bloom. "Sir," she said softly, "you're bleeding." Edward glanced down, frowned briefly, then waved a hand as if brushing off an insect. "It's nothing, Grace. Just the stitches healing." The doctor said, "It's normal." Grace's eyes didn't leave the spot. She'd seen surgical wounds before. Her younger brother had needed an operation years ago, and she remembered the surgeon warning the family about signs of infection or internal trouble. That dark shade, the way it kept spreading. It wasn't right. But Edward had already wheeled himself toward the window. Conversation over. That night, Grace lay in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling. The estate was silent, the kind of silence that usually comforted her. But tonight, it pressed against her ears. She kept seeing that red stain. Her mind kept replaying the slight slump in Edward's shoulders, the way his hand trembled more than usual as he moved the wheelchair. She told herself it wasn't her place. She was just a maid. There were trained professionals for this. Doctors, nurses, people with degrees on their walls. But another voice inside her pushed back. If they were doing their jobs, why did no one else notice? By morning, she'd made a decision. When she entered his suite that day with his breakfast tray, Edward was sitting by the fireplace, robed loose, a distant look in his pale blue eyes. She placed the tray on the table, then glanced at his chest again. Her heart sank. The stain was bigger, darker, spreading. "Sir," she began carefully, "I think we need to have that wound checked again." Edward didn't look at her. "Grace, I told you." With respect, she interrupted, a risk that made her pulse race. "I think it's worse than you think." His head turned sharply. No one interrupted Edward Langford, but instead of anger, she saw fatigue in his gaze. "It's nothing," he said again, softer this time. Grace stood her ground, though her palms were damp. Nothing doesn't grow overnight. Nothing doesn't make your skin this pale. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the fire crackling between them. Grace's heart pounded in her ears. She didn't know if he'd order her out or listen, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't ignore this. Not when every instinct told her something was wrong. What she didn't know was that within the next few minutes the situation would turn from quiet concern to a fight for his life. Edward's pale eyes lingered on her for a few seconds longer. Then he sighed and looked away. "Grace, I've lived long enough to know my body. I'm fine." Grace's jaw tightened. "And I've seen enough to know when someone isn't," she replied quietly. He gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." Before she could answer, his fingers twitched against the armrest. His breathing hitched, and his body leaned forward slightly, as if the weight of the world had suddenly settled on his shoulders. Grace's instincts flared. "Sir." Edward's lips parted to respond, but what came out was not words. It was a low, pained gasp. His hand shot to his chest, clutching just above the robe's collar, where the stain had spread wider. His wheelchair trembled under the sudden movement. In an instant, Grace was beside him, one hand gripping his shoulder, the other pulling the robe aside to reveal the wound. The skin around it was red, inflamed, the stitches straining against a deep, dark seep of blood. She could smell the metallic tang in the air. Her voice was firm now, almost commanding. "You're not fine. Stay still." Edward tried to speak, but his words dissolved into a shallow cough. Grace didn't wait for permission. She reached for the napkin on the breakfast tray, folded it, and pressed it gently but firmly against the wound. Warmth soaked through almost instantly. Her mind raced. The private doctor was 2 floors away, the estate sprawling. If she left him to get help, there was no telling how quickly he might weaken. She made a decision. With her free hand, she pulled the small cordless phone from the side table and hit the emergency button for the medical staff. Her voice was sharp, urgent. "This is Grace in Mr. Langford's suite. He's bleeding heavily from his surgical site and showing signs of distress. I need a doctor here immediately." The operator began to ask questions, but Grace cut in. "No delays now." She dropped the phone back onto the table without waiting for a response. Edward's breathing grew uneven. "Grace, it's just a setback." "No," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "It's your life, and I'm not going to watch it slip away while everyone tells you it's nothing." Minutes felt like hours. She kept pressure on the wound, adjusting the napkin as more blood seeped through. Edward's skin was clammy beneath her fingers, but she could feel the faint, stubborn rhythm of his heartbeat. Finally, the door burst open. Dr. Myers, the estate's on-call physician, hurried in, followed by a security guard carrying a medical bag. The doctor's expression darkened the moment he saw Edward's chest. "He's hemorrhaging," Myers muttered, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "We need to transfer him to the hospital immediately. Help me stabilize him." Grace stepped back only when Myers took over, but she stayed close enough to see the paramedics rush in moments later with a stretcher. Edward's eyes found hers as they lifted him. "You were right," he whispered, his voice weak but sincere. She forced a small smile. "We'll talk about it when you're back." The ambulance siren faded into the distance. The suite felt unbearably quiet again. But the silence was no longer heavy. It was charged, waiting for news. Hours later, Grace was summoned to the hospital. She walked into Edward's private recovery room to find him propped up in bed, looking tired but alive. Dr. Myers stood at his bedside, explaining that the bleeding had been caused by a partially ruptured artery near the surgical site. If it had gone unnoticed, Myers said gravely, he wouldn't have survived the night. Edward turned his head toward Grace. "They told me you refused to leave my side until help came. I just did what anyone should have," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No, Grace. Everyone else ignored it. You saw me." From the drawer beside his bed, he pulled out an envelope and handed it to her. Inside was a letter and a set of documents. She scanned them, her eyes widening. "It's the deed to a house," he explained. "By the coast, somewhere you can live without answering to anyone. You've earned it." Her throat tightened. "I can't accept." "You will," Edward interrupted gently. "Because I wouldn't be here without you." For the first time in years, Grace saw softness in his expression, not the guarded look of a billionaire used to control, but the gratitude of a man who'd been given a second chance. And as she left the room that day, the sun spilling through the hospital windows, Grace realized she hadn't just saved his life. She'd reminded him it was worth living. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more emotional, dramatic, and unexpected tales. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing from all of you. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep watching.